Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 141. Today's guest is Sarah Gailey. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. Today, I'm happy to bring you another KTCO Book Club conversation. This time, I'm talking with Sarah Gailey about H.A. Clarke's Scapegracers novels. Sarah Gailey is a Hugo Award-winning and best-selling author of speculative fiction, short stories, and essays. They have been a finalist for the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus Awards for multiple years running. Their best-selling adult novel debut, Magic for Liars, was published by Tor Books in 2019. Their most recent novel, Just Like Home, and most recent original comic book series with Boom Studios, Know Your Station, are available now. Their shorter works and essays have been published in Mashable, the Boston Globe, Vice, Tor.com, and The Atlantic. Their work has been translated into 7 different languages and published around the world. You can find links to their work at sarahgailey.com and on social media at GaileyFrey. Now, longtime listeners may remember that Sarah has been a guest on the show twice before, first in 2017 to talk about their American Hippo novellas, and then again in 2020 to discuss their YA novel When We Were Magic. I'll just say I'm always so happy to get the chance to talk with Sarah about anything, really, and I also very much trust their taste in fiction. Some particularly great reads have come my way via their newsletter Stone Soup, or just from their Twitter feed back in the day. So I knew that whatever Sarah picked for our book club conversation today would be a winner, and that turned out to be so true. H.A. Clarke's Scapegracers novels, of which the first 2 are currently available and the third will be out in the spring of 2024, were engaging and unexpected in the best ways. I do want to mention before we get started that, as always with our book club discussions, there will be some spoilers, so if you want to go into these books completely fresh, I recommend stopping now and saving this episode for after you've read them. There are links in the show notes to purchase the books from Mysterious Galaxy here in San Diego, as well as from Loyalty, a Black, queer, and Asian-owned bookstore with locations in Silver Spring, Maryland, and Washington, D.C., which Sarah chose as their bookstore to highlight. As always, I also highly recommend ordering from your own local independent bookstore. A couple of other things I wanted to mention quickly. First, the paperback edition of Sarah's gothic thriller Just Like Home will be coming out very soon. That'll be on May 30th, 2023, and I've put purchase links in the show notes. Also, I mentioned Sarah's newsletter. Well, something I wanted to highlight is an essay series they've been running on that newsletter called The Personal Canons Cookbook. 2 to 3 times per month, Sarah shares a recipe on their newsletter that is paired with an essay from the recipe's author. I just wanted to share a bit from how Sarah described this series in the introduction they wrote. When we share food with each other, we make meaning from the sharing. Whether you're feasting in triumph or lament or reflection or toil or rest or gratitude, you'll have reasons to connect a meal to a moment. That moment will become a memory. Maybe it will grow into a tradition. Maybe you'll share it with your community. Maybe it will come to define you. Ultimately, no matter the reason for a shared meal, the truth of the feast is that it exists to create connections. This is going to be true of 2023. No matter who you are or where you live, you'll have cause to feast this year. The Personal Canons Cookbook is an invitation to share in what food can be to us and to our communities. It's an invitation for all of us to feast together, no matter the reason. End quote. You can subscribe to Sarah's newsletter, including the Personal Canons Cookbook, at stone-soup.ghost.io, and there's a link in the show notes for that as well. Okay, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Sarah Gailey about H.A. Clarke's Scapegracers novels. Thank you so much for coming on the show again and for recommending these books to me. I really enjoyed them. And so the books we're going to be talking about today are The Scapegracers and The Scratch Daughters by H.A. Clarke. These are, I'm not sure if you would, what the exact subgenre title is. I would call them like YA paranormal fiction. Does that seem about right to you?
Sure. I think that that's probably where they would get shelved in a store. I always kind of hesitate with books like this to assign a genre because there are so many expectations that come, especially with people who are very passionate about the genres that they like to read. And this one has it's got YA kind of age focus and life stage focus in a very honest way. It also, I think, has a lot of adult crossover appeal.
I mean, I actually think that the genre expectations are a big part of what made this book so interesting to me. But I want to back up and just say, what was it about these books that made you want to pick them for our talk today?
Oh my God. I mean, I've never read anything quite like them before. These books are intense, highly saturated, absolutely gripping. Scapegracers, the first in the trilogy, is a guaranteed reading slump buster for me, which is very important to me right now because I keep on having a hard time reading stuff.
Same.
I just find them so energizing as an author.
So these books, do you think you can give us like a little quick synopsis of them? I mean, we can delve into it and we can get as spoilery as we want, but just sort of to give the listeners a little overview of the books that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, my kind of like I'm trying to get someone to read these synopsis is, these books are about a group of teen girl witches who are every bit as feral and vicious and ravenous as characters like that deserve to be in text. It's kind of like if every character in The Craft was played by Fairuza Balk. They are vicious and messy and incredibly honest, and very much about the way that real, true, sloppy friendships gel all of a sudden when you are in your late teens, and the way that magic can make that feel so much more powerful.
Yeah. From the very beginning of the book, the comparison with The Craft is something that was in my mind a lot, but in a way that feels, I mean, like the feel of it at the beginning especially was kind of similar to me, but in a way that, what am I trying to say here? It's been so long since I've seen that movie. But this felt more honest in some ways. Like, I think one of the things that, like, when I was talking about the genre expectations, I feel like because of movies like The Craft or movies like, for example, Mean Girls, we have a certain expectation of how a story like this is supposed to go, right? And I feel like at basically every turn, H.A. Clarke is subverting those expectations and doing something entirely different. Does that seem fair to you?
I mean, I think yes and no. I think that there are places where Clarke subverts expectations, and I think that there are also places where Clarke says exactly the thing you expect is going to happen, but it's not going to have the emotional consequences that you assume it'll have. I think that's what I mean when I say this book is very honest, because there are a lot of like fictional tropes that I think we really bring into our relationships because we learn this is how you're supposed to react, right? Like, I don't know, someone finding out that their partner cheated on them and freaking out and being really angry, even if they don't necessarily organically feel anger or betrayal, just because that's sort of the script that gets handed to us. And these books have a ton of that. These books have a lot of someone is angry and betrayed, and you kind of expect it to be a long, drawn-out drama, and instead the person says, I'm mad at you, but I still love you. But I love you in a mad way for a little while, or you get like a parent who could react very negatively to someone, doing something that they're not supposed to be doing. And the parent does have the negative reaction, but that reaction is driven from a different place than the place that would be easy and sort of default. And so even when the plot expectation isn't being subverted, I think the emotional expectation frequently is.
Especially too, because I feel like the characters, well, particularly the point of view character Sideways, are aware of the fact that these are tropes, right? That she sort of has this understanding of like, this is sort of how things are supposed to go. But she does this thing in her head where she's like aware. It felt very, very real to certainly my experience of being a teenager, where it's like, I'm having these feelings. I feel like the feelings are stupid, but also like, I feel like I'm supposed to be feeling these feelings, but also I feel like the fact that I'm supposed to be feeling these feelings is also stupid. I felt like there was a lot of that happening, and it just felt really, really real to me, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And I experienced that a lot as a teenager too. I remember there was this boy in high school who was a very dear friend of mine, and we kind of like toyed around with the idea of getting together. And then he met someone else who I believe he ended up marrying, who at the time, you know, he kind of pulled me aside and he was like, look, I know you and I have kind of been like having a little bit of a thing going, but I really want to get serious with this person. So I think you and I need to not follow up on, you know, some of the conversations we've been having. And I said, oh my God, that's fine. I'm so happy for you. Like, I love that you get to be with this person. They seem really good for you. I love our friendship. And then I thought for a minute and I was like, wait, shit, can we go into a crowded hallway and can I call you a son of a bitch and slap you in the face? And he, you know, in hindsight, this is like one of the friendships that was really good for me because this was someone who really understood me and affirmed some of my weirdo-ness. And he was like, oh my God, yes, I wouldn't pass up that opportunity. And we got to take advantage of this. And so we went into a crowded hallway and I yelled, you son of a bitch. And I slapped him in the face and, you know, pretended to storm off. And it was this moment of just like, oh, wait a second. We have the opportunity to play out the script that we know we're supposed to. And like, there might not be the emotional like reality behind it that would make it happen organically, but we can't pass that up.
That's excellent. Okay, so the book, it starts off at a party scene, and we're introduced to all the main characters very quickly in this party scene. The three girls who are sort of the it girls for their school, who are Daisy, Jing, and Yates. And then they're throwing this party, and they've hired Sideways for $40 to come and cast a spell to make their party the spookiest party. And I feel like this opening is really intended to bring us right into this kind of story, right? Where I feel like it's really setting up a certain kind of expectation. I couldn't help thinking of immediately, even though the books overall and even the opening scenes are very different, but I couldn't help thinking of your book, When We Were Magic, which I think I've told you this before, but just in case I haven't, is one of my favorite books. I love that book so much.
Oh, that means so much to me.
That book just made me radiantly happy when I was reading it, even though in the first page it does involve a boy's penis exploding. So. And the other book that I immediately brought to mind was Maggie Takuta Hall's Squad. And I feel like just there's something about this sort of teenage party milieu that is so ingrained in our sort of cultural consciousness that's like immediately we have this scene and it really it's such a foundational starting point for us that it gives us this idea, okay, this is the world that I'm in, and really sets up like this is what I feel like I'm going to expect from this book. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love Squad so much. I'm sorry. I know that's not the point.
No, but everything Maggie does is amazing.
Yeah, absolutely everything. Yeah, I don't know. I'm very interested by in both Squad and in the Scapegracers trilogy. I'm fascinated by that party milieu. I wasn't in that crowd. I didn't go to parties in high school or kind of ever. I've never been a real party person. I don't know if there just wasn't a party culture in the town that I grew up in, or if everybody knew that I was too kind of square to be in that crowd. But I'm always fascinated by it. And I'm especially fascinated in this series by the role that it plays in the lives of these teens and how they still, they go to school, they're boarding class. They are dealing with like normal cafeteria drama. And it's not a sort of heightened euphoria situation where it's like everything is about the party culture. It's like, no, this is part of their lives. It feels so organic and so gritty the way that so much in these books does. And by that, I don't mean gritty like like a 2005 prestige primetime drama. I mean, gritty, like it has grip to it. It has like, you can really hang on to it and you can sink your teeth in and get your fingers stuck to it, you know?
Yeah. I think that sense of things being organic is really like something that Clarke does really deftly throughout this series, where nothing feels like shoehorned in, nothing feels like unearned, but it also, nothing feels like, well, I'm going to use the word fantastic, but I don't mean in terms of like there is a fantasy element to the plot. Obviously there's magic, but what I mean is that like, for example, the book is very queer. There is a side character who's trans, who like doesn't really appear too much in the story, but like they're just kind of like there, this sort of Sideways is semi-friend that's, I think, kind of there to provide sort of a contrast. But like, Sideways has 2 dads. None of this stuff is like, it's not that it's not commented upon, right? Because it is, but it's also not like, it's not. I remember seeing this meme go around a while back where it was like the different generations responding to seeing gay people in a commercial, and Gen Xers.
Oh my God, I love that meme. I just remember
the Gen Xers being like, "Oh, that's really good," and then the millennials being like, "Oh, okay," and then the Gen Zers having no response at all.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's like in a book like this, all of these things are just sort of part of the town and the world. It's not being presented as like, here's something that I'm doing. It's more like, this is just how it is. And there are like consequences for like some of these things. Like Sideways does encounter some homophobia throughout the books, but also, I don't know, it just feels really real to me. I don't know if I'm articulating myself very well.
Oh, you are. And that's something that I love in these books. You know, I am still of the opinion, and have been in the opinion in the past, that it's not necessary to include depictions of bigotry especially in genre fiction, that it's not required for a sense of realism. And I think that, I still feel this way, but I also increasingly feel a sense of excitement when I see bigotry included in ways that have an impact. I think the sort of nuance and shading that I've slowly added to this opinion over time is that it's not necessary for realism, but if you're going to use it, you need to use it well, kind of like white chocolate in desserts. I'm like, this doesn't have to be here. It's not always adding anything, right? In your like Swords and Dragons world, you don't need someone using the F slur. Like it's fine. It's not necessary. But in a story like this one that is so much about the absolute sidewalk level reality of being a queer teenager in a small town, it adds so much. Sideways' experiences with bigotry are also incredibly realistic because they're survivable, but are we a swearing podcast?
Yeah. Yeah.
They fucking suck, right? Like, it's fucking awful for Sideways to get called a slur and get into a fight, but it's also like just part of reality. And it's also a character moment where you see that this character is ready to throw down. Sideways, I love Sideways. I'm obsessed with Sideways, and Sideways is always ready to fight. And the fight isn't always the right decision, right? Like Sideways is a teenager. They are impulsive. They are emotional. Their feelings sweep them away, and they do things that later they're like, well, I don't even know if I wish I hadn't done that, because I don't know if I can imagine not doing it. And I just love that I'm sorry. I love these books. I go off on tangents. I go on a tear.
It was interesting. I read a few reviews of these books after I was done, and I felt like the reviews were really bimodal, I guess I would say, where some people were really, really sort of effusively praising them, and some people were like, I can't stand this character and the bad decisions that she makes and like all of this. And I just thought to myself, this seems like a real like sort of case in point about what this book is about.
Yes.
Like, because, I'm 43 years old. I'm going to be 44 this year. And, so reading a book like this, I read it with a sort of like like when the characters make a bad decision, there is this sort of like protective feeling that I have for them, you know, like, oh, honey. And I hope that I doesn't mean it in a condescending way. It's more like I can remember myself making really bad decisions as a teenager and feeling like I wish somebody would have said, oh, honey, to me, you know?
Oh, yeah. No, I feel that. I feel that precisely. That kind of like, I understand that this is the only way that you can be, and that you have to go through life fucking up and hurting in your heart. And also, I feel so much affection and tenderness for that journey that they have to go on.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things I thought was really interesting is like the book really foregrounds this way that people dismiss and really dislike, well, women in general, but particularly teenage girls. There's even like a really specific line. It's page 108 of the first book. It just said, I guess my point is that teenage girls aren't supposed to be powerful. You know, everybody hates teenage girls. And it's like, boom, right there on the page. And when I was reading that negative review, I was like, yeah, that's true in our world too.
Yes. I mean, I want to say first, I love readers. I love all kinds of readers. And I think that every reader is entitled to their opinion. And frankly, like, there's rarely such a thing as a good opinion or a bad opinion when it comes to someone's experience of a book. I always try to maintain the stance that the conversation that a person has with a book is between them and the book, and none of those conversations are wrong, except sometimes they are. And when that conversation is, God, I hate teenagers, and especially teenage girls, and how they don't make all the same decisions that I, as an adult with a fully formed frontal cortex and complete control over my own life, would make.
Yeah,
those conversations,
and the experience of having fucked up as a kid.
Yeah, those conversations, I think, do have wrong opinions in them, and they drive me kind of nuts. And they make me sad, because I think what they really reflect is, you know, you and I look back at the teenagers that we once were, and we say, oh, honey, I wish I could go back and take some care of you in the way that you needed. And then there are some people who look back at the teenagers who they once were and say, God, I really hate that person. They were so stupid and shameful, and I wish I could hit them with a big hammer. And it's like, so sad for them. It's like, no, feel tenderness and compassion and understanding for this person who you were, who was trying to become your own person in a world where you had no control over any of your circumstances.
Yeah.
And in a world in which every feeling was magnified 1,000 times compared to the way you feel it now.
Yeah.
And no one had ever taught you any coping skills. No one had ever taught you how to set a boundary. No one had ever taught you how to have healthy conflict. And you were having to figure it all out on the fly as you go. Like, of course you're going to make decisions in that circumstance that you wouldn't make now as an adult, because you're a different human with a different life. And it's maddening to me when people say, I hated this book because they made bad decisions. I'm like, do you want your book to have a plot or not? What do you think a story is made of? It's made of mistakes.
Yeah. Well, and of course, adult fiction is full of that as well. And people tend not to make those same accusations about those books. I would personally be lying if I said I never wanted to hit my teenage self with a hammer.
Of course.
But, you know, as I've gotten older, I do have a lot more compassion for my younger self. But really, I think that this is what makes a book like this interesting, is the characters, right? Because, and especially Sideways, the point of view character, that, you know, I feel like if you have somebody who just always makes the right decisions and doesn't have anything, I don't want to say like wrong with them, but like doesn't have any problems, you know, it's like, that's just a boring character, you know, and especially in the context of YA, I feel like there is a sort of strange tendency lately, I mean, or maybe a resurgent tendency sort of recently to sort of view literature in general, but especially YA literature, through this lens of like, it's supposed to be morally correct, or it's supposed to be like teaching you something. And I find that having that as your standpoint, where you want everybody to be like unproblematic unless they're the villain kind of thing, is I mean, one, it's just it makes for uninteresting stories, but two, it just feels very heavy-handed and didactic. And whereas with a book like this, I mean, we actually get a surprisingly small amount of information about Sideways' backstory. It's sort of dribbled out in drops over the course of the two books so far. And what we do get is really, I feel like, adds a lot to our understanding of this character. But she's also someone who's clearly been traumatized. She gets traumatized again in these books. She has this sort of prickliness to her and this sort of leave me alone kind of vibe that I really recognize from my own youth as like a person who is suffering. And it's these qualities that inform the decisions that she makes, but it's also these qualities that really allow me to see her as a whole person and to empathize with her and to really be kind of rooting for her, you know? Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I also see the trend in a desire for morally instructive fiction. When We Were Magic, as you mentioned earlier, it opens with a boy dying in a pretty intimately violent way. And, he stays dead. The consequence of his death is his death. And I had a lot of pushback, not from the company who eventually published it, who were very supportive, but as we were trying to sell the book, and from readers in the time since saying there should be more consequences. There should be a clearer moral guideline in this book saying murdering someone by accident is wrong and you shouldn't do it. And I'm like, first of all, I don't think you should need me to tell you that. I think that people are capable of understanding on their own that killing someone is bad to do and you shouldn't do it. And second of all, I think that we build a culture in which people do not know how to forgive each other and themselves when we seek out that moral instruction and that sense of consequence and villainy in our literature. We build a society in which someone does something fucked up and that is their identity and they're stained forever. It's a very fundamentalist Christian perspective on morality and interpersonal dynamics. And I think it needs to get thrown into an active volcano. It's so harmful and so hurtful to people, to even just people's understandings of themselves. We all have done things that we regret and that we wish we hadn't done. And we try to grow as human beings while still hanging on to all these regrets and mistakes and saying, well, this still defines me. We've got our little Javers inside our own minds that we have to kill, chasing us around and saying, you must be brought to justice. And something that I love in these books is that's not here. These characters do things that are wrong. They hurt each other. They treat each other badly sometimes because that is the nature of human relationships. And then they say, okay, that doesn't mean that you go in the trash. That doesn't mean you are exiled forever. That means we acknowledge that you fucked up and then we decide how we continue knowing each other with that understanding. We engage in rupture and repair in relationship. And I think that that's something teens need. It's something I needed as a teenager. I needed to see people have a fight and take some space and then come back together and have a relationship on the other side of conflict. I still need it now as an adult.
Yeah,
so much.
Same. Yeah. I feel like this sort of question of justice, it is something that comes into the book because, another thing I'm reminded of Squad, because in that book, it's teen girl werewolves eating sex pests. And it's in that sense, again, we can agree that murdering people is a bad thing. But there is something about the way that's done in that book that really does make you, if you're not an asshole, it makes you yeah, go get him. But even at that, in that book, there's, I think, a sense of, for the main character, of moral conflict that happens with her. And in this book, there's a similar thing where the coven later in the book and into the second book they're hexing these bad teenage boys. And what I found really interesting about it is that, for one thing, it's always in a way stemming from, like, these are boys who have actually hurt people. They've actually hurt girls. But also, it's not exactly retribution that they're doing. It's more like, because the way that these curses that they put on these boys, it's not like they're killing them. They're making it impossible for these boys to do the, like, shitty and harmful and, you know, like, rapey kind of things that they've done in the past, by saying, like, if you touch a girl with ill intent, then it's going to come back around on you, kind of thing. So it feels really, even in that, where these girls that form this central group for the book, they get very fired up, they get very angry, they get very, and rightly so, but they're also very restrained in how they respond to these people, or at least that's my read of it. How do you read that?
I think that the hexes are fascinating. I think so. The specific hexes that these group of girls end up calling themselves the Scapegracers, and they call the hex a Chet hex. They name the avatar of terrible boys and men Chet, and when they hex a boy, they name him Chet to themselves, and that applies the hex to the boy. And, you know, like you mentioned, these are the terms of the hex, right? Like, if you speak to a girl with ill intent, if you touch a girl with ill intent, if you look at her with ill intent, there will be physical immediate consequences. And I love this hex because it's simultaneously quite restrained. You're right. They're not killing these boys. They're not even hurting them immediately. They're just saying, you don't get to do this activity anymore. And if you do, you have, like, kind of a shock collar kind of situation. But the hex is also vicious. You know, if you look at a girl with ill intent, you will go blind. If you try to touch a girl with ill intent, you will experience physical agony. They're not gentle, and there's no valuable lesson being learned here about forgiveness and about kindness and patience. These girls feel the rage that especially young girls feel in the face of a world that deserves rage in response to it. You know, I see this a lot with my nieces. They will learn about an injustice and they have the proportional reaction of, what's wrong with you adults that you haven't fixed this? Why is this still happening? This is not acceptable and it should not be this way. And the Scapegracers have that depth of feeling in them. It hasn't been stomped out by the exhaustion of constant encounter with injustice over the course of a life where you just have to figure out how to be okay with things that are fundamentally not okay.
Yeah.
And I love that these books give them that viciousness in all of their dealings, but especially in this hex. They are given full reign to be as pissed as they deserve to be. And I think that's one of the things that causes that, like, what I think of as a kind of weenie reaction when people are like, you know, how come there's not more consequences? How come they make bad decisions? Is that they get to be pissed and angry and use that anger for something. And I just love that.
I mean, I think that the whole idea of that there are not consequences, it's not like these things that they do, like they are enraged and for good reason, but it's also not like they never have doubts about these things. It's also not like they don't go through a certain amount of emotional consequence for these things. You know, like there is a lot in these books about the way that, and like the quote that I said before about the way that people hate teenage girls and teenage girls aren't supposed to be powerful. And there is a lot fundamentally about these books that the story is about these teenage girls finding and using their power. But there are also real consequences, like towards the end of the second book, they do actually end up killing somebody, and it's sort of by accident. They don't really know how to. Sideways is like not entirely sure how she feels. She knows she doesn't feel good about it, but she also is like, well, but that kid that got killed was also one of the witchfinders who are the main antagonists in the book, which that whole thing about the witchfinders I found really interesting in how they operate by ostensibly in their own lore that they're doing something to try and protect the world, but really what they're doing is stealing power from these girls and women and using it for themselves, which I thought was, I mean, I don't think it's intended to exactly be an allegory, but from an allegorical perspective is really pointed. But, you know, at the end of the second book, when through their actions, which they take in order to try and save a situation, more or less, but somebody does end up dying. And that's something that does weigh on all of them. And I have a suspicion, since it does happen fairly close to the end of the second book, I have a suspicion that it'll probably be something that comes up again in the third book. And I think that this is something that goes along with a lot of the sort of more YA fiction that I've been interested in recently, whether that's something like Squad or When We Were Magic, or I recently read the first of the Folk of the Air novels called The Cruel Prince. And that character also makes some spectacularly bad decisions, but there are, if not necessarily legal consequences for these things, I think it's incorrect to say that there are no emotional consequences, you know?
Right. No, absolutely. And the way that the Witchfinders are handled, I find to be also really emblematic of H.A. Clarke's complexity and kind of complex dealings with the idea of protagonists, antagonists, good guys, bad guys. You never get a stark black and white perspective from the narrative, even when the characters feel black and white. There are times when the characters are saying, this person deserves to be erased from the face of the planet. And as a reader, you can agree with that character and be kind of on board with their anger while also seeing the way that the narrative is saying, well, not everybody's irredeemable. Not everybody belongs in the system that they've chosen to participate in. Sometimes people feel trapped in the system that they've chosen to participate in and trapped on the wrong side of a conflict. And that shouldn't be erased, right? There's no, again, I'm sorry, this book really, I think, pushes back against a lot of kind of American Christian indoctrination and ideals, in that it's like, no, if you do something bad, you don't get everything you've done totally erased just because you try to clean up your act. But you also don't get it pinned to you forever and ever. You know, you can change and grow as a person, and that doesn't mean forgetting where you've been and what you've done. And it also doesn't mean making that the central part of your identity. And this gets applied even to the antagonists of this series, the Witch Hunters, in a really complex and, I think, brilliant way.
Yeah. So you're talking about, again, we're going to be spoilery in this conversation, but like, so in the second book.
I'm so sorry. All my instincts are always to avoid spoilers, and I keep on forgetting that we're allowed to say things.
Yeah. So in the second book, the events of the first book, sort of broadly, and this was actually, I'm going to come back to this, but you can actually condense a synopsis of this book pretty short, because in some ways not actually a lot happens, but that's actually something that I really like about it, is that the book takes its time. But so in the events of the first book, the party happens, the girls become friends with each other, they spend some time exploring that relationship, and then they are found by these witchfinders who are, as I mentioned, they're basically men and boys who steal the witch's power and use it for themselves, in convincing themselves that they are actually doing something good for the world. And then along the way, also Sideways meets at the first party, Sideways meets this other girl whose name is Madeline and has a crush on her. They start this budding romance, but it turns out that Madeline is kind of using her because she was a witch and had her magic stolen. And so she needs to steal Sideways' magic in order to enact her revenge on the witchfinders. And so there's all this stuff that happens in the first book, in particular about 120 pages in. Sideways herself gets kidnapped by these witchfinders, has to make this daring escape. And throughout the whole rest of the book is pretty clearly suffering PTSD from that incident as well. And yet in the second book, we're introduced to this character who in the first book is named Caleb, and in the second book is revealed to be Shiloh, a character who participated in that abduction, who is one of the members of this Witchfinder family, but feels trapped because they realize they are trans, and eventually they get thrown out of the family for that. The way that this interaction happens was so interesting to me because, one, it's Sideways knows that by taking care of this person, that's going to cause problems for her friends. They're not going to understand and they're not going to appreciate it. But she's like, I can't leave a baby queer out to freeze to death, in this winter. And when they bring Caleb/Shiloh into their home, Sideways and her two dads, it's really interesting the interactions that they have. Like there's a scene where they're sort of introducing this newcomer to the dads, and there was this scene where they're talking about their political leanings and saying, I guess you're probably like a Republican or something. And they say, I'm a libertarian. And the dad kind of makes a face and says, we'll work on that. I thought that like little things like that, where it's like these, especially the dads, but Sideways also are responding to this by saying, it's not your fault that you were brought up this way, kind of thing. I'm going to teach you about the history of your community. And it was such a gentle and tender kind of way of having this interaction go, in a way where it's through the whole thing. It is very emotionally freighted. It is something that causes a lot of conflict for Sideways and her friends. It also causes a lot of sort of internal conflict. Like, what am I doing? This is the bad guy. But also really complicating that question just in the way that you're saying of like, we can't forget the things that this person has done, and they don't want it to be forgotten. They take every opportunity to remind, like, I've done terrible things that I can never atone for. And they're not actually absolved of that, right? But they are also still brought into this family, still treated with respect and with love and with nurturing. And I don't know, there was something really lovely about that whole thing. You know what I mean?
I mean, I think that this is one of the things that makes these books, to me, feel capital I important. We don't get a ton of representation in contemporary media of how messy community actually is supposed to be. And this character, Shiloh, I've never seen any character like this in contemporary media, where you can say to someone, it's not your fault that you have always believed the things that you were told and acted on those things. And we're still going to hold you accountable for what you did. These books are so deeply anti-cop and anti-carceral state in just like really profound and radical ways and challenging ways, right? Ways that say like, this is unpleasant to be up against sometimes. Like, as human beings, and especially as human beings who live in a fascist country, we are constantly fighting against the instinct to punish. And we're constantly fighting against the instinct to shut out the things that we don't like and the people who we don't like, and to label them undesirable and get rid of them. This is something on a smaller scale we see in our communities all the time as we deal with like the question of ostracization of community members who have committed the heinous crime of posting cringe or of being really messy about their emotions. And the way that that is kind of conflated with systemic community harm is kind of like, how can we be expected to grapple with the question of rehabilitation and like actual justice in cases of actual harm when we can't even do that with people whose, big harm that they've caused is like being kind of fucked up for a little while to people.
Yeah.
And these books really engage with that. They say, okay, how do we look at every level of ways that people hurt each other? How do we look at ways that we hurt our friends in relationship? How do we look at ways that people hurt each other by being complicit in broken systems? How do we look at the ways people hurt each other through neglect? How do we look at the ways people hurt each other through actual direct, immediate, violent harm? And what does it look like to say something like, yeah, I'm going to be mad at you for the whole rest of my life for what you did to me, but I also don't think that you as a queer person should have to be homeless and friendless, and you deserve to know who you are and find the place that you belong, even if sometimes I really don't like you.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a hard question, especially because, like you say, living in a country that is increasingly fascist, it's hard to have any kind of nuanced understanding about these things. It's hard to say, what are the principles by which we're going to live, together and understand each other, when, especially on the other side of things, there is no such introspection happening. What you were saying just now, it reminded me of, this was, a while ago. It was back in 2015. I remember seeing this interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates, and he is a person who is well known to be against the death penalty. And shortly after the church shooting in Charleston, somebody asked him in an interview, well, what about somebody like this? What about somebody who goes into a black church with a gun and kills a bunch of people? What about then? Does he deserve the death penalty? And Coates kind of took a second and said, I think that if you're not against the death penalty in the worst, most difficult situations, then you're not actually against it. And I feel like that is kind of applicable here, because this character Shiloh admits to having participated in these things and has probably killed people through their actions, which, I mean, obviously that is a much bigger thing than just being cringy in a community space, right? I mean, that's something for which there cannot be a restoration. A person's life has been taken and it can't be restored, right? That is not something that can be brought back. There are permanent consequences of their actions in the world. And so I think a lot of people would feel very justified in saying, we need to just get rid of this person, right? And in fact, many of the characters in the book say exactly that. And yet Sideways and her dads refuse to do that. Now, her dads don't know the full extent of what Shiloh has done in their past, but finding a way to say, like, these are the principles by which I live. And if I'm not living by them in the hardest, most fucked up situation, then are those really my principles at all? Like, I feel like that's a very applicable question to this story. You know what I mean?
Exactly. This is such the perfect example, because, like, the reason to be against the death penalty is not because you personally never want anyone to die in retribution for their actions. That's not the reason to be against it. The reason to be against it is because you have the knowledge that your desire for someone to die should not cause them to become dead. People try and get this like as a gotcha all the time, where they'll be like, well, what if someone had, done horrible things to all your loved ones? Then wouldn't you want them to die for what they did? And it's like, yeah, of course. I want someone to die when they cut me off in traffic sometimes. That doesn't mean that they should. We don't get to make that decision about each other. We don't get to make that choice that someone else no longer deserves to be alive. And that's what's at the core of that belief. And that's why I love how angry these books are, because that belief in restorative justice, that belief in the abolition of the carceral system, that belief in the abolition of punishment, that fundamentally anarchist belief, it's not opposite anger. You don't have to be a perfectly peaceful, sanguine, like, Zen icon who never wishes ill on anybody to believe that you shouldn't have the power to make those choices about other people's lives, and to believe that even if you hate someone with your whole heart, that still doesn't mean that you get to end the one existence they ever get to have. And I just find that profoundly powerful.
Yeah. One of the things and so I mentioned this a bit ago, is that this book both books really, they really take their time. So in the first book, like we're brought into a scene that's kind of more or less an action scene. It's this party scene where there's magic happening and there's a mystery that's set up about like some weird shit happens and you're like, ooh, this is spooky. What's going on? And then the book takes more than 100 pages to kind of come back to this, right? It's really more about establishing the relationship, this new friendship between Sideways and this group of girls that they eventually form this coven together. And I feel like this is sort of how both books are, that like there are these points in the story where things move very quickly and things are happening and things are very tense. But in between, there's all this time for things to sort of stretch out, take their time, and really focus in on the sort of relationships that are happening, which I noticed in some of the reviews. Some people found that, I don't know, unpleasant or boring. But for me, it was like, that was where the book was really living to me. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. These are very patient books. They're packed, right? There's like so much adventure and there's so much happening, but there's also a sense of real breathed life, right? Characters don't just go from one thing to the next. They take their time and they reflect and they rest and they recover and they grieve and they panic and they build relationships. And I find it, kind of like, kind of relaxing to read as a writer, because I'm like, oh, right, you don't have to be just going from one thing to the next. You can sit with your characters and let them exist. And it also is really energizing as a reader, because it's like, I get to know this person. This person is a human being. Something that I love that these books do is Sideways has, kind of a depression relationship with personal hygiene. And will frequently be like, yeah, I haven't brushed my teeth in like 2 days. I haven't taken a shower in a long time. My hair feels greasy. I don't feel good. I go and wash myself and I feel brand new. And it's like, you don't get that a lot with characters. You'll get them being like, I'm in all these action situations and then I go take this bath and wash the blood off me. And that's important, is getting the blood off me. But in Sideways, you get the inside experience of that. And that just feels so emblematic to me of what you're talking about, the slowness of these books, that is really just groundedness. It's really just like every footfall really lands. And, you get to hear growling stomachs and you get to see fatigue and you get to see real sleep and rest. And it's just so human and so embodied in a way that I love.
Yeah. Yeah. It also really, I think, drives home, again, like coming back to this word of consequences, that like everything that happens in these books has an effect on the people in the books. And I think for me, that's really why those in between moments are the moments that kind of sing the most to me, because that's just like what life is like, is a lot of your life isn't necessarily in these like big flashbulb moments. It's in the aftermath, and you live in the aftermath a lot longer than you do live in those moments. And I feel like this book is really interested in showing us that aftermath and then how that continues to progress,
Yes. Yeah. The aftermath and the in-betweens matter so much in these books. And they matter not just in the way that the silences matter to Jazz, but in a way where it's like, no, you grow when you're resting. I recently had a doctor tell me that the kind of long-held wisdom that you shouldn't eat too close to bedtime is bullshit, because you don't stop. Your metabolism doesn't stop when you're sleeping. Your body doesn't stop doing things when you're sleeping. It's doing a lot of repair work. It's doing a lot of like processing, and it's still doing a bunch of stuff. Like nothing about the way that you metabolize nutrients changes while you're asleep.
Yeah.
And that this doctor was basically telling me that wisdom is really just people trying to be like, do intermittent fasting, but sleep your way through it. I thought about that a lot while I was rereading these books for this podcast. Just how much happens in that downtime and in those in-betweens. How much characters find themselves, how much thought happens, how much recovery really matters. It's very powerful, and it feels transformative, honestly, to see on the page.
Yeah. So this is already going long, and I apologize for that. But there was one more thing that I wanted to sort of talk about, and that is Mr. Scratch. And this is another moment where I feel like the book is really, especially the first book, that we're set up to think a certain thing, and then it turns out not to be true. And so we are introduced to this being sort of towards the middle of the book. Sideways and her friends have gone to this sort of witch clearinghouse that they discover, and they're trying to break in order to steal some spell books. And because she gets really frustrated at one point, she knocks over this urn and it shatters on the floor and releases something that you assume is going to be some kind of a demon, especially with a name like Mr. Scratch. And especially given that the person who catches them in the act, when he discovers that that particular urn has been broken, he's like, "Oh no, what have you done?" and runs away. So you're really given this opportunity to say, I know what's going to happen here. This is going to be a creepy thing. And this entity is going to ultimately is going to be charming, is going to worm its way into Sideways' good graces and then turn out to be a monster. Because that's how these things always turn out, like in the movies and in most stories. And yet it really does not turn out that way with this character. And in a lot of ways, this character becomes sort of a third father figure. There was a quote from the second book that I pulled out where Sideways is having a hard time and I believe this is like a scene where she's like in the trunk of her friend's car because the friend is like, she's on the outs with some of her friends, but also they are trying to do this hex and they feel like they need her there. So she's sort of hiding here to participate, but so that the ones who are mad at her don't know that she's there. And she's having all of these feelings. And Scratch says to her, "You love your friends. You love giving and receiving love. I don't condemn the children I've had who pick the quick medicines for things. The world is a very sharp place for daughters, particularly and especially mine. I've watched them wither over it, though. I hate to watch it. I want you all to bloom." And I just thought, that's what a good parent would say in that moment. And it was really interesting to me the way that this character is brought up in such a sinister way and turns out to be such a supportive and even self-sacrificing character for Sideways. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yes. I mean, I love Mr. Scratch. I love that subversion of expectations. I love that Mr. Scratch becomes someone to be cared for. And I love that Mr. Scratch is not either all-knowing and evil or all-knowing and wise all-knowing and good. I love that we get this character who's like, no, the thing that I want is to love a group of people who love me back. This is so much a character who's written as someone who has been ostracized and imprisoned, and whether or not the kind of underground society who did that to Mr. Scratch was wrong to do it, it was the only thing that they knew how to do, right? They were like, well, this thing's going to be dangerous and we don't know how to deal with it, so we're locking it up, which is what we do culturally. Often when something seems dangerous and unpredictable, we lock it away and we say, okay, get rid of that. And this character is not perfect and is a little scary sometimes, but also Sideways literally brings him into her own body, in order to engage with him. And it's we can't fix things that we don't invite inside. We can't take care of things that we don't invite inside. We can't send things out into the wilderness and say, okay, go figure out how to be good, and then we'll bring you back. And I just love that. These books were transformative to me. That is not an exaggeration. And this character was transformative to me in thinking about the things in my life that I say that's too unpredictable and too dangerous, so it's got to be gotten rid of.
Mm-hmm. Well, I so much appreciate that you gave me the opportunity to read these books. I hadn't been familiar with them before, and I really enjoyed them. I'm really looking forward to the next one. And I believe you said in the pre-show that that's going to be coming out in the spring next year. So that'll be something to look forward to for sure. I do always like to end by asking if there is some other piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Yeah, I recently read this graphic novel, or maybe it's a collection of comics, called Exit Stage Left. And I feel it's amazing to try and explain this book to people because it is a licensed property featuring the character Snagglepuss, who, if you're not familiar with him, is a giant pink cat with like a very gay accent. It was part of the Hanna-Barbera properties, along with like Yogi Bear and Huckleberry Hound. And this comic reimagines Snagglepuss as a closeted gay playwright during the McCarthy era. And it's the most moving, powerful comic I think I've ever read in my life. It's immediately one of my favorite pieces of media that I've ever encountered. It is about the cost of trying to be in a creative field during a moment of fascist censorship. It's about who our society protects and who it doesn't. It's about fame and how fame can be taken away or granted based on the caprices of a society that changes its mind about what it likes and doesn't like very easily. And it's a powerful, powerful piece of media about a period of queer history when all we were trying to do was find each other and not get murdered. And again, it is about the character Snagglepuss. It's a crazy, crazy combination, but it's so, so brilliant and powerful. And I think everyone should read it.
Well, that's gone right on my list for sure. Thank you so much for talking with me today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
This was such a pleasure. It's always wonderful to get to talk to you. I love being on the show. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to yell about these books that I love.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, there are links in the show notes for you to purchase copies of The Scapegracers and The Scratch Daughters, as well as Sarah's book, Just Like Home. You can also find links to Sarah's website and their excellent newsletter, which includes the Personal Canons Cookbook. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shay Aguinaldo. If you liked today's conversation, buy those books, tell a friend, and share the episode. You could also warm the cockles of my heart by leaving a review of the show on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. There are links in the show notes for that. And you can find all of the show's contact info, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechanneleopen.com. That's all for now. Coming up next month, I'll be talking with my good friend Rachel Zucker about her new essay collection, The Poetics of Wrongness. That will air on June 28th, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.